Last time we spoke about several significant points connected with the ways of interpreting literary texts, ways of studying them, and we also spoke about some very basic things about the history of English literature, its uniqueness compared, for example, to Russian literature, and the main stages of its development. So the first thing we discussed was the necessity in some cases when we're speaking about literary texts to pay attention only to their linguistic forms, to have some idea of the actual meaning of the words, the syntactic constructions, and this is the only thing we need to understand when we read certain literary texts. No extra linguistic commentary is actually required. And when we looked at Shakespeare's sonnet number 18, the handouts of our previous lecture, it's clear that we might feel like knowing when the sonnets were written, who the author of them was, what was his biography, who is the person who is being addressed in the text, but at the same time, it's quite possible to understand the meaning of the text without this extra linguistic information. There are other situations when we need to know something about the historical period described or about the biography of the author and the historical period described, or just the biography of the author, to understand a literary text. And if we look at such works of art, we understand why in the title of our course we have not only the classic texts, but also the mentioning of the authors and of the ages, of the epochs when the texts were written. Without the knowledge of this, it is sometimes quite impossible to understand the meaning of the text, which is considered to be an example of classic English poetry. Last time we also managed to speak about the famous monologue of Mark Antony from Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare. And it turned out that without the knowledge of some basic facts of Roman history, it's quite impossible to understand who Mark Antony is, why he's addressing his listeners like this, why was Brutus and Julius Caesar, why was Brutus mentioned, why was Julius Caesar mentioned. So we do need the knowledge of the historical situation, and we need to know the actual meaning of the play by Shakespeare. But if we understand that at a certain point, Julius Caesar was killed by the conspirators who thought he was thinking of establishing tyranny in Rome. The conspirators were headed by Brutus, who had been formerly a friend of Julius Caesar. But together with his co-conspirators, he decided that Caesar was really dangerous and that democracy in Rome would not survive if Caesar were not killed. And so the murder is carried out, and then the people of Rome receive an explanation from Brutus why it was necessary to kill Caesar. And after receiving this explanation, the Romans agree that after all, the actions of the conspirators were reasonable. And there is only one person in Rome, really, who has some power to revenge the death of Julius Caesar. And this person is his friend, Mark Antony. The conspirators know that Mark Antony is potentially dangerous, but Brutus feels that it's wrong to continue shedding blood, and he says that Mark Antony might be spared, his life might be spared, if he is explained that if he tries to revenge his friend's death, he would be promptly murdered, not actually by the conspirators, but by the people of Rome themselves. But Mark Antony still feels like turning the tables, reversing the situation, and he asks the conspirators' permission to address the people of Rome when Caesar is being buried. He receives this permission, and he wants the people of Rome to react almost immediately and to reconsider their idea of the behavior of the conspirators. But he understands that he can't address the people of Rome directly. And he begins by saying that the honorable people, Brutus and his friends, killed Caesar, who probably deserved this killing. And then he carefully begins to enumerate the good things done by Caesar, constantly interrupting himself with this phrase, but Brutus says he was ambitious and Brutus is an honorable man, in the sense that, after all, Caesar, in spite of all his good deeds, did deserve his fate. But then the accumulation of good deeds becomes so obvious, in Mark Antony's opinion, to his listeners, that he finally decides to stop using this circumlocution and addresses the people directly, saying that, after all, he had done a lot of really good things, and you loved him when he was alive. Why don't you mourn for him now that he is murdered? And according to Shakespeare's play, the Romans at last understand the inadequacy of their own behavior and the criminal nature of the behavior of Brutus and his friends. And further on, in the continuation of the scene from Shakespeare's play, they decide to attack the conspirators, and Mark Antony is, as a result, victorious. In the text itself, there is very little to bewilder the reader, because lexically, again, it's quite clear. But the historical digression, this kind of explanation, is necessary. The text we didn't have time to consider last time was the famous monologue of Hamlet, To Be or Not to Be, Act 3, Scene 1 of the most famous play by Shakespeare, Hamlet. And here we have really considerable difficulties, and it would not be enough just to retell the relevant part of the Danish history, especially as Shakespeare probably had invented the better part of it. If we read the text when Hamlet speaks about suicide, we feel really bewildered. It's the beginning of Act 3. In the previous two acts of the play, in Act 1, the story of the ghost begins. It turns out that the ghost of Hamlet's father is regularly appearing, and as a result, the guardsmen become suspicious and apprehensive when at night they see the ghost of Hamlet's father, and they feel that probably the ghost wants to speak to Hamlet. And finally, the meeting of Hamlet and the ghost takes place in the very last scene of Act 1. The ghost tells Hamlet the whole tragic story of Hamlet's father having been murdered by his uncle, who is now King of Denmark. The ghost asks for revenge, and Hamlet quite decisively says that, of course, he would revenge his father's death. No mentioning of suicide in this context, and it's quite clear why Hamlet wants to revenge his father's death. And then unexpectedly, in Act 2, Hamlet suddenly begins to doubt that the ghost's words were true. He said that you never know the location of the actual ghost, where he comes from, above or from below. And in this context, he says that the ghost could have been just provoking him, and in fact, the uncle had not been guilty of the father's murder. And as some actors come to Elsinore, the castle where Hamlet and the whole royal family stay, Hamlet asks the players to perform in his uncle's presence a scene from a play which he would actually write himself that would resemble the scene of the murder of his father. And if the king reacts accordingly, then Hamlet would know that the ghost had told him the truth, and he would promptly kill the uncle. That's the end of Act 2. And then in the beginning of Act 3, we hear this interesting soliloquy. Hamlet speaking about suicide. So far, there had been nothing in the play to explain why Hamlet might feel suicidal. In Act 1, he believes the ghost. In Act 2, he decides to check whether the ghost had been telling him the truth. But there is no reason for him to feel suicidal. There might be some reasons, and they had been invented, beginning with the psychoanalytic explanations. But on the whole, judging by the behavior of the main character, there are no reasons for him to doubt the validity of the ghost's words whatsoever. And then comes the celebrated monologue, which had been interpreted variously by generations of readers and of literary critics. It is said that Hamlet is a Christian humanist, and for this reason he doesn't want to kill the father, but why should he decide to kill himself? He is a romantic character opposed to the world. Shakespeare was writing some 2 centuries before Romanticism had appeared. And as the play during Shakespeare's lifetime had been very popular and was performed in the presence of not so sophisticated spectators, it's difficult to imagine that they somehow would have shared the ideas of Romanticism, which would appear some 200 years later, and that the thousands of spectators would be satisfied with listening to the monologue of the main character, where he speaks about suicide without any apparent reason, that these people would listen to it and they would not object to the apparent illogicality of what was happening. So for them, there must have been some logic in what Hamlet said. Otherwise, the play would not have become that popular. We may say that they could have missed this particular monologue, but in Act 1, Scene 2, we already have a monologue on the similar subject, the famous monologue, "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt," where Hamlet also speaks about suicide. So it's completely impossible to miss this motive, because Shakespeare mentions it at least twice and at length in his play. And so when we read the text attentively, we must ask ourselves a question: was it really explained in the text why Hamlet felt suicidal? And if it wasn't, why was the play accepted by his contemporaries? For them, at least, it must have been clear. So when we look at the text, we will see that, in fact, it's very strange if some explanations, probably of the historical and literary kind, are not authored. Well, the beginning is clear. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is noble in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more. And by sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep. To sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but at the tread of something after death? The undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with a pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great purpose and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Soft you know, the fair Ophelia, nymph, in thy orisons be all my sins remembered. So why is Hamlet saying it all? Быть или не быть, вот в чем вопрос. Благороднее ли разумом страдать от прощей стрел яростной судьбы или вооружиться против моря бед и, противясь им, с ними покончить, с бедами? Умереть, уснуть, не более. И можно сказать, что благодаря сну мы заканчиваем сердечную боль и тысячи естественных как-то ударов, страданий, которым подвержена плоть. Таково завершение, которое следует желать. Умереть, уснуть, уснуть. И, возможно, видеть сны. А вот тут как раз загвоздка. Потому что в этом сне смерти мысли о том, какие сны могут нам присниться, мысли о том, что будет, когда мы отрясли земной прах, вот это должно заставить нас задуматься. Вот что создает тягостность долгой жизни. Ибо кто бы терпел кнуты и насмешки времени, дурное поведение угнетателей, оскорбление гордых, боль отвергнутой, презираемой любви, медлительность законов, оскорбительное поведение чиновников и, опять-таки, насмешки, которые терпит терпеливое достоинство от недостойных. Вот кто бы это все терпел, если бы сам человек мог достичь своего покоя просто с помощью кинжала? Значит, кто бы терпел, опять-таки, тягостную жизнь, если бы не страх чего-то после смерти, неизвестной страны, из пределов которой не возвращается ни один путешественник? Это озадачивает, так сказать, волю, тормозит наше действие и заставляет нас скорее сносить те беды, которые у нас есть, чем стремиться к другим бедам, о которых мы ничего не знаем. Так раздумие делает из нас трусов. И так естественный румянец решимости бледнеет из-за бледного оттенка мысли. И начинание великого масштаба и значимости из-за этого оборачивают свое течение вспять и теряют имя действия. Помедли, благородная Офелия, нимфы в своих молитвах «Помяни все мои грехи». So, that's the Russian text. I didn't want the poetic translation. If you need it, you may take any amount of the Russian versions of To Be or Not To Be, of which there exist about 33, more than 30. But I hope that even in this inadequate translation, it becomes clear that Hamlet is enumerating the difficult things every person comes across in his life, and every person would have loved to do without them and would have loved to commit suicide because it's so unbearable. But as this person is afraid of what would happen in the afterlife, he doesn't commit suicide, although the desire is very strong. A very strange text if we look at it within the context of the play. There are no objective reasons for Hamlet to think of suicide. After all, he does not love his uncle. It was not in any way a surprise to him that the uncle could have killed the father. If he had loved both the father and the uncle, and now the father or the ghost of the father demands the murder of the uncle, and Hamlet loved them both and couldn't think of killing the uncle, in this case probably it would have been understandable why he was not ready to kill the uncle, and why was he thinking instead of committing suicide. But as there is nothing of this kind mentioned in the play, we might have a feeling that Shakespeare either meant something different, which was clear to his audience, or that he wrote some incoherent text. And strangely enough, there are readers who are ready to admit that Shakespeare could have produced something incoherent, that there was an old play which he would rewrite, he would use this play and probably plagiarize upon it, but then he would return to the play and change the plot, and so he forgot what he was writing about. That is why the play, the way we know it, is a weird collection of scenes, quite illogically brought together. So that's the possible way out. At least people are honest when they are admitting their inability to understand the logic of the play, and they continue quite logically saying that the play is illogical. But again, as the spectators, presumably, of this particular play, published during Shakespeare's lifetime, and then with some changes 7 years after his death, in his collected works, first published in the year 1623, people probably had watched this play, and they had probably seen some logic in it because it was so popular. So what was it that they could see in the play? The answer is simple, and at the same time, it's a very complicated one because we require a lot of historical information to understand the meaning of Shakespeare's text. As the theater of the Elizabethan England was not just a place for people to enjoy the aesthetic value of plays, it was also a place where certain significant points of immediate importance were discussed. It's natural that we should look at the immediate historical situation in Shakespeare's England, and try to understand why the main character, who had to do something against the king, and spiritually he was attached to the ghost who was asking him to act against the king, still was unable to do it. And he was unhappy to the extent that he would be thinking about suicide. A very long historical explanation is required to explain what Hamlet could have possibly meant in this monologue and what Shakespeare could have possibly meant when he was writing Hamlet as a whole. But I will give just one hint. The 16th century Europe and the 16th century England witnessed the most horrible period in the development of Christianity, Reformation and Counter-Reformation, which brought forth numerous religious conflicts. And we know, all of us, about Saint Bartholomew's Night in Paris, in France, the fight between the Catholics and the Huguenots, but we know surprisingly little of Reformation and Counter-Reformation in England. But in fact, there was such a thing as Counter-Reformation. Protestantism was not accepted unanimously by all the English people in the 16th century. Rather, they would have preferred Catholicism, at least, till the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, most of them. And in this situation, when they had been experiencing an acute conflict between the necessity to follow spiritually the Pope of Rome, who did not accept Queen Elizabeth administratively and insisted that she should be deposed, and at the same time, they wished to follow administratively the local ruler and not some international organization. Those English people who did not wish to accept Reformation spiritually and the Queen administratively, and those who did not want to accept the Pope of Rome spiritually and administratively, they got into really an impossible situation. Both the Queen demanded this double allegiance and the Pope demanded the same. He insisted that he had authority in matters administrative and spiritual. The Queen insisted that she had an authority in matters administrative and spiritual, while most English people would have preferred to act the way their forefathers had been acting for centuries, to obey the Pope spiritually and to obey the Queen administratively. And as both the Pope and the Queen demanded complete allegiance, these people felt terribly uncomfortable. If they obeyed the Queen unquestioningly, it would mean that they would accept Protestantism, and for most Catholics, it would mean betraying Jesus Christ and, as a result, suffering in the eternal life for an indefinite amount of time. They were not ready to risk the salvation of their soul by obeying the Queen spiritually. But this was the only way to survive in Elizabethan England. They would have preferred to obey the Pope spiritually, but it would imply acting against the Queen and probably supporting the Spaniards, who in their turn were supporting the Pope of Rome. And again, it was an impossible situation for the patriotically minded Englishmen. They didn't want the administrative obedience to the Pope, but the Pope demanded it because the Queen was a heretic. And so acute was the feeling of insecurity, of the necessity to betray your nearest and dearest who could have been Catholics if you became a Protestant, and in this case you would have been asked to report upon your nearest and dearest. So acute was the conflict between this desire to be a good Christian and at the same time to be a good Englishman, that a lot of people could have thought in this direction, the way Hamlet is thinking, who doesn't want to obey his uncle spiritually, and who doesn't want to obey the ghost or the desires of the ghost in the administrative sense. So that's the possible explanation. It requires a much longer commentary, but I have used this text to show why in so many cases when we speak about a literary text, the knowledge both of the biography of the author and the knowledge of the history of the time when he was writing a text is absolutely necessary to understand some literary work. So that was the part of the first lecture, which I had not finished last time. I am finished with it now. And we had several other points to consider. Last time, we said that the history of the English language is quite diversified and unexpected in some cases. The English language went through a period when it was on the verge of disintegration. And still, because of its long history and the wealth of authors writing, the quality of the text of the authors that were writing, in fact, the English language had reached its modern stage much earlier, for example, than the Russian language had reached its modern state. And we say that classic English literature has at least 5 centuries of its history. Now let's turn to the history of the language yet again. We spoke about the main periods when the English language was functioning and when it was changing. The Old English period, which lasted until 1066, but of course it's very difficult to give the exact dating. The language doesn't stop being what it is overnight. So if we're more careful with dates, we might say it was the year 11,000 or probably even 1150, but here we can't be very clear. We can't be sure that that's the right dating. And for this reason, the year of the Norman conquest is mentioned usually as a marking point, although we must understand that, of course, the drastic changes took place a bit later, or probably much later. And then this Middle English period begins, which continues until the year 1500 approximately. Then for 200 years, we have early modern English, and then beginning with the year 1700 approximately, we have modern English in the proper sense of the word. So more than 3 centuries of completely modern English and 5 centuries of relatively modern English. Now I would like to give you some examples of what Old English and Middle English looked like. We remember that the English language belongs to the family of Germanic languages. It was spoken by the tribes which came from the northern part of Europe to the British Isles, somewhere in the 5th or the 6th century. That's why it's the Germanic language. It got to the British Isles because of the migration of the belligerent tribes who spoke some Proto-Germanic language or some dialects, all of them unified by similarity of lexis and similarity of grammar. And so these peoples, these tribes came to England. They occupied various parts of it, and till the beginning of the 10th century, there existed small independent states like Kent, Wessex, Northumbria, Mercia. They were fighting with each other. They were fighting with the foreign invaders. And of course, their life was spent mainly in protecting themselves from their neighbors. They also loved suppressing the neighbors and taking the goods that the neighbors had produced or accumulated. And of course, in this situation, it's difficult to expect any serious cultural development. But in fact, the development was there. It was connected, first of all, with the work of the learned monks, because the learned monks were the only learned people, really, to be found in the then England and in Europe generally. And this learnedness, the level of education of the monks, incidentally explains why the Catholic Church, the Roman Church, was so popular and so powerful. It's a paradoxical situation when, in the absence of normal communication, in the absence of the internet or the telephone, an international organization with a center in Rome suddenly became so influential on such a vast territory. And in England, English priests were, of course, obeying their kings, but they were also obeying Rome. It's a truly paradoxical situation when, in those distant times, we suddenly find an international organization which was so strong. But, of course, it was not always so. There were periods when the Roman Catholic Church was not at all influential in Europe, and there would be periods when, on the contrary, they would be arguing successfully with the then European rulers and would insist that they were the primary power in secular matters as well as in matters spiritual. It so happened because the church was a very useful organization for the European rulers. First of all, the churchmen were basically literate. They were educated. They could read and write. And if an emperor like Charles the Great is sending orders to the distant parts of his empire, he must make sure that the orders are properly understood by someone in a particular distant part where they are sent. So there must be a faithful clergyman in the distant part of the empire where the letter is being sent. And also the king must be sure that his lands one day would not be confiscated, would not be taken by the enthusiastic member of the church who becomes powerful there in a distant place in question. And of course, in this case, the celibacy of the clergy, the impossibility for them to have legitimate children, was a very useful thing to the rulers. Of course, those priests might have legitimate children. They might try to give them the lands which they had originally received from the emperor or from the king, but at least the likelihood would be much less compared to the situations when you have as your representatives the aristocrats who had the official right to marry and to pass his lands to his relatives. So into senses at least, the church was useful to the kings, and they supported this organization for this reason. And the church, apart from ingratiating itself and accumulating wealth, was at the time the key organization to promote learning, to promote juridical knowledge and help to the rulers. And they also took care of the education of the people around. They provided medical help, psychological help, social help when it came to the periods of famine, when the population of a particular region, dukedom, kingdom, county was to be supported. So the monasteries had extreme cultural value, social significance, and it's clear that if we are to look anywhere for the examples of literary texts written in those times, the church archives would be the place for us to turn to. And it was in those monasteries that the literary tradition was established and was supported, and that the literary texts were kept. So, briefly, some examples of Old English. It was a collection of dialects, and the predominant dialect finally became that of Wessex, with a center in Winchester. King Alfred, the person who is believed to have united England, but in fact his son did most of the work for him. All the same, Alfred is really great because he initiated this process of making England one country, and he initiated the process of the unification of the country and its cultural development, the spread of literacy. And as a result, close to the end of the Old English period, the Wessex dialect, Wessex being the center of the country, Winchester being the main city, the Wessex dialect was becoming the basis of the global literary language in England. Then in Middle English period, everything would change, and it would be no longer Winchester, but London, Oxford, and Cambridge that would collectively matter in forming the other Middle English variety of the global national language. But on the whole, when we speak about Old English, we of course mean not the London dialect, but the Winchester dialect, the Wessex dialect. So look at those texts, how different they are from what we find in modern English. And there is the modern English variant attached. So you will be able to compare what we have in modern English and what they had 1,000 years ago. Там слушает нас девушка. Ага. Сейчас. Сейчас. Ага. Ага. The first example, it's not exactly poetry, it's not a poetic text, but it gives a good illustration of what the Old English colloquial texts looked like. It's an extract from a translation by King Alfred of a piece of Latin text written by a certain man called Roses. Here it's not, of course, the translation, because it's the description of the voyages of two Norsemen, but it is included in the translation, presumably carried out by King Alfred from Latin into Old English, and this piece of text is inserted. It's the description of a voyage, of a travel by a Norseman called Ochthere, who is reporting to King Alfred some significant geographical knowledge. And we, of course, can only surmise what this text sounded like, how the words are to be pronounced, but presumably it sounds like this. Ochthere sede his glaverde Elfrede Koninge, zat he elre Norsmane Norsmust bude. He quest that he bude on sen lande Norswerdum with sa Westse. He said that land the Suize lang Nors sonnen. Ak hit is el Weste, buten on fairwom stovum stuke melum, wikjes finnes, on huntuse on wintre, and on sumere on fiskese be serre se. I believe it's quite impossible to understand without the English translation. Ochthere said to his lord. You see, it's the same word, glaverde. We can explain phonetically how it happened that glaverde became lord. Hl became lh, so it became lhaverde. H disappeared, it became laverde. AF disappeared between the vowels, and as a result, without F, it became lorde, lord. So this is the phonetic process that may be described, and there are various terms, of course, developed by specialists in historical linguistics, but we see how different the word was compared to what it is 1,000 years after it was fixed. So Ochthere said to his lord, King Alfred, Koninge, said he elder Norseman, Norseman's Bude. Bude means lived. Он где был, даже не lived, а просто был, да? Elder Norsemana, elder it's all, Norsemana, Norsemen, Norwegians, possible to guess what it is, said possible to guess, but Koninge possible to guess, that he, elder difficult, Norseman, Norseman's Bude impossible, Glaverde impossible. He quest said he bude on some London, Norswerdum with sa Westse. He said that he lived in the land that is northward along the Western Sea. Quest, meaning he said that he lived, that he was on the land to the north of the West Sea. He said that the land is very long to the north from here. He said sat land is clear, said clear, sat the accumulation of those pronouns and conjunctions unclear, lang nor son, and so on. It's not a poetic text, and I introduce it just for you to have an idea of how different modern English looked compared to its older, much older variant. Some simple words are clear. Some words of the Germanic origin finally disappeared in modern language. And syntactically, as you see, it's quite simple. Just the mentioning, the naming of rather elementary objects or notions with the minimal description with the help of the adjectives. Also in old text, the next example. Last time I've mentioned Bede the Venerable as one of the celebrated scholars of early English science. He lived about 150 years before King Alfred became king, the enlightened of England. So Bede the Venerable, of course, is a legendary figure, but we might assume that this learned monk actually lived during the years which are indicated here, that he wrote some treatises on natural sciences and a text describing the history of the English Church. And so in his text written in Latin, there is an interesting piece of information concerning a certain unlearned shepherd, неграмотный пастух, who suddenly had an inspiration and he wrote a hymn glorifying the Creator, and it would be translated in the mid-8th century in Northumbria later. So that's an example of how a man with a very ordinary background suddenly becomes inspired and begins to create sublime poetry. So it's, of course, some piece of propaganda. We cannot really check whether Cadman had existed, whether he had written what he is believed to have written. But an example is quite interesting because it's the mid-8th century in Northumbria. So what does he say if we look at the modern text? Now let me praise the keeper of heaven's kingdom, the might of the Creator and his thought, the work of the Father of glory, how each of wonders the eternal Lord established in the beginning. So let's praise the Creator. That's the idea. He first created for the Son of Man heaven as a roof, the holy Creator, then Middle Earth, the keeper of mankind, the eternal Lord, afterwards made the earth for man, the Almighty Lord. So several times in similar words, the Creator, God Almighty, is mentioned. So the information as a result is reduced because there is such a regular mentioning of God Almighty. But the writer of the Old English text tries to be rhetorical, tries to show the significance of what he is saying, and as a result he produces something that may be read like this. Nusculen herien heaven rikes word, methodus mechte and his mod gesang. Werk wulderfeather suiche wundra hichwes, eke druchten o estelide. Erst skop elde barnum, hebben til grove halek skepen, sa midungerd monkenes ward, eke druchten efter tiede, firum foldu fre almächtig. We can recognize some English, modern English words here. Ward, meaning ward, keeper. The first line, mächte, we might guess that it has got something to do with might. Mod gesang, difficult to guess. In fact, it's just thought. Wuldur feather. Feather, it's clear, the rest is not. Wundra, as a wonder, the third line, probably it's possible to guess. Ekedrichten or estelide, impossible to guess. He, clear. Erest skop, eldra barnum, impossible. Heaven, that's clear. Till hrove, as a roof. Here again, there is the change of the position in modern language, as in hlaverde. Here we have hrove, which becomes rhove, then it becomes roof because the H goes. Halich skepen, halich meaning holy. Midundegard monkenes word, again the keeper word. Ekedrichten, impossible. Efter tede, after meaning after, possible to guess. Firum foldu fre almächtig. As you see, There is practically no similarity between this text and its modern English translation, which again shows how greatly the English language had changed since its early beginnings. What is poetic about the text? Just the fact that different words are used to denote the same phenomenon, the same object, or rather the same person, if we think of God Almighty in that personal way. And the subject is very pious, it's significant, it's the sacred thing that is being discussed, but probably few people would enjoy this kind of text. Then we have the example from Beowulf. Again, it's an early text. There are considerable difficulties with the dating because it's the 8th century or the early 11th century. And here we already have a clear example of the alliterative poetry. In the previous, by the way, text, we also had Methodes merte mod sank in one line, 3 words beginning with M, werk wuldur feather sue wundre gichwes. Again, 3. And that was the idea of alliterative poetry. The line is divided into 2, in the middle, into 2 half lines, and there should be at least 3 words beginning with the same consonant in a line. So that was the structure of the alliterative text. Furs fors gevat, flotte weson usum, but under berge bernes hierve, but berge bernes, on steven stigen, stremas wunden, SSS, sunt with Sunday, sekes barren, on bern, nakan bergte fretwe. Gutser jetelig, woman utskun, whereas on wilsis wadu bundene, and so on. Again, a different kind of text. The previous one was devotional, the other one was conversational, and here we have poetry, alliterative heroic poetry. Time had now flown, afloat was the ship, boat and the bluff. On board they climbed, warriors ready. Waves were churning, sea with sand. The sailors bore on the breast of the bark their bright array, their mail and weapons. The men pushed off on its willing way, the well-braced craft. So thrice the ship is mentioned. The men who are entering the ship. They moved over the waters by night of the wind, that bark like a bird with breast of foam, till in season due on the 2nd day, the curved prow with course had run, that sailors now could see the land, see cliffs shining, steep high hills, headlands broad. It might be interesting to people who either want the information about the development of the English language or who are ready to enjoy this kind of text. Information, I wouldn't say that it is really excessive, but there is the rhetorical basis, the words which would not be found in ordinary conversational texts. This is what the Old English looked like. And what we notice is the presence of the words, which we can barely recognize, but somehow recognize, belonging to the Old Germanic stock. The presence of words which would disappear later. Flotte weson usum. afloat was the ship. Usum disappeared, but becomes boat. Under Beorge. Beorge disappeared. Beornes Hierwe, on board they claimed. On Steven Stigan, Stramos Wundern. They disappeared, these words, and instead, either new words were introduced from the old Germanic stock, but it's more likely that some words from Romance languages, Romance borrowings, would be used instead of them. And if this kind of lexis was simply absent in the history of the English language during a particular period in Old English, these new words which would also be introduced from the Romance stock with the help of Romance borrowings and not through the use of the native material. So now we have looked through the three texts of the Old English period: a conversational, a devotional, and the epic text. I won't speak really, and it's my deliberate choice, of the linguistic differences. This information may be found easily in the internet, the description of the history of the English language. Either we need to spend a lot of time discussing it, or we just mention some very basic things. Lexically, the language would develop in the direction, of course, of broadening the word stock with the help of the Romance languages, with the help of the Romance borrowings in the future. Grammatically, it would become much easier. There will be the words which with complicated inflections that would later disappear in modern and even Middle English. Both the verbal, the nominal systems, which had originally been very complicated, would be greatly simplified, and English, which had originally been very similar to what we find in even modern German now, would become a much easier language to learn and to use. And there would be the fixing of the word order. There would be the tendency towards using prepositions instead of case forms. So that would be the way the language would be developing. And there would be constant phonetic changes. And it's quite an interesting undertaking to study the development of Hlavarde into Lord. And there are many processes involved with each particular word which had existed, for example, 1,000 years ago, the way it is functioning now. But we are not going to speak about it because it will take a lot of time, and it's not directly connected with this question of the classic English poetry, modern classic English poetry, which we are supposed to study during our course of lectures. So the Old English period finished, we may say in 1066, we may say it was the middle of the 12th century, but clearly it was finished at the point when the Normans conquered England and when they began to get the power, the administrative power in the land. Before that, various charters would be written either in Latin or in Old English, but now that the Old English aristocracy had been either destroyed or brought to a position of complete subservience, the Normans were getting the power in the land, and of course, official texts would be written in a language that would be clear to them. It would be either some variant of the French language, or some texts could be simply written in Latin. That was the idea. And For a long period in the history of the English language, the general tendency of its development was quite unfortunate, because England was controlled by the French-speaking people. The English language was not used in official situations. It was not in any way prestigious, though it was the vernacular, the language spoken by the indigenous population. And so English, which had almost become a literary language at the end of the Old English period on the basis of the Wessex dialect, in the Middle English period was deteriorating into a collection of dialects, some of which mutually incomprehensible. Texts were still written in the English language. They were quite scarce. Again, they were written by the monks, and they were later found in monasteries. But there was a very dramatic difference both in spelling and in the grammatical and lexical items used. So the general tendency was quite unfortunate. And it lasted for almost 2 or 2.5 centuries, even 3 centuries, until it became unpatriotic to use the French language in England. It so happened because at some point the rulers of England decided that they had the right to occupy the throne of France. And the 100 Years' War began in the year 1337. For us, logistically, it's quite difficult to imagine how English kings wanted to control France, with the British Channel or La Manche being there, means of communication being quite poor. How was it that the English rulers decided to control France? It sounds rather absurd, but paradoxically, they had had the experience of their ancestors to lean upon, because England and France had been practically one country already in the year, not in the year, in the 12th century. Difficult for us to imagine, but it is true. William the Conqueror became King of England in 1066. He died in 1087. Then his son, William II, William Rufus, Wilhelm Rigi, was ruling the country for 13 years. And in the year 1100, the youngest son of William, King Henry I of England, began to rule the country. He was King of England for 35 years, and in the year 1135, the king died. He had had a son who was drowned in the global catastrophe in La Manche when several hundred people belonging to the English highest aristocracy drowned during a storm. And as a result, Henry I was left with just one daughter, who had been an empress at some time of her life, married to the German emperor, Matilda. But as she was a daughter, the English nobles were not quite sure whether they would like to have her as the ruler of England. And the king, Henry I, who died in 1135, had a nephew called Stephen, who, in the opinion of some English aristocrats, was a better choice for the position of the king. And immediately after the death of Henry I, a war lasting for about 20 years for the English throne began. The famous war between Matilda and Stephen. Война между Стефаном и Матильдой. It lasted till the end of Stephen's rule. Stephen himself had a son, but as he was losing in this fight for the power with Matilda, finally it was decided that when Stephen dies, Matilda's son would inherit the throne. He was the grandson of Henry I, the great-grandson of William I, and so when King Stephen died, Henry II, the son of Matilda and the grandson of Henry I, became King of England. And it was during his reign that very serious changes in the political importance of England throughout Europe began. Matilda, the Empress, was married for the second time to a French person called Geoffroy Plantagenet, who owned very big territories in the province of France called Anjou. So from his father, Henry II inherited these lands. And then Henry got married to the former wife of the French king, Eleanor of Aquitaine, the famous Eleanor, who had been first wife to the French king, then she divorced and she became wife to the English king. She was some 10 years older than Henry, but it didn't really matter. And by the way, she had outlived him. She had lands of her own, which she did not leave to the French king when they were divorced. And so the whole of Aquitaine, an enormous territory, now it's modern France, but then it was an independent dukedom. This land also became the land of the English king, Henry II. So half of modern France, in fact, quite peacefully, without any wars, became the property of the English kings through successful marriages. And this period in the history of England is associated with the functioning of the so-called Angeline Empire, называлась Анжуйская империя. So the English kings, already in the middle of the 12th century, had the experience of ruling quite successfully two kingdoms separated from each other by this piece of water called the British Channel, La Manche. And so, after Henry II became the owner of such lands, it had to be expected that there would be problems with controlling them. And Henry spent the better part of his life having military conflicts, including the military conflicts with his sons. The territory he was controlling was so big that he had to make his son, his eldest son, also Henry, his co-ruler. But the son became rebellious. He was supported by his younger brothers, the future King Richard the Lionheart among them. And so Henry was having great trouble fighting his sons who were being supported by his wife. And he was a short-tempered man. It was better not to provoke him because he would not be able to resist the provocation. The person to provoke him once, or more than once, was not just his son, side by side with his sons, there was a very powerful and significant representative of the then Church of England called Thomas Beckett. He was a commoner. He did not belong to the aristocracy. He was very efficient as an official, and one day Henry promoted him to the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury. He nominated him, the Pope agreed, and practically immediately after that, Thomas Beckett, who had previously been interested in accumulating wealth, importance, significance, power, suddenly became an artist, a very active fighter for the supremacy of the church in the land. And he was getting on the king's nerves thoroughly and actively until in the year 1170, Henry was about 38 years old, and Beckett was approaching 60, if I'm not mistaken. The conflict became so violent that the king is reported once to have said, in the presence of his aristocrats, of his court, "Is there nobody in the land who would free me from this turbulent priest?" And so the four aristocrats present took the hint. They went to Canterbury and killed Thomas Beckett in the cathedral. That was the sacrilegious act, because murder generally is not a very good thing. But if you kill a person on the territory of the church, it is doubly horrible. And so Henry did it, but the results were unexpected. An interdict was announced, and no church ceremonies would be carried out in England because the Pope forbade it. And as people were really dependent psychologically on that stable cycle of Christian rituals, Christian rites, christening, burial, confession, they were not ready to risk the salvation of their lives in the future by obeying their king. And so Henry had to repent for his sins, and he had to apologize, he had to suffer other kinds of punishment. And for 3 years at least, he felt terribly uncomfortable because of the pressure upon him exerted by his own subjects and by the Roman Church. So for Henry, life was never easy, but still he managed to control vast territories, which his sons began gradually to lose. First, it was Richard the Lionheart, who spent the better part of his life in the Crusades. And then there was King John the Lackland, who also was losing territories. And by the middle of the 13th century, England, in fact, was controlling very little on the French territory, but at least it becomes clear now why the English kings in the 14th century thought it possible to wage a war against France in spite of those logistical complications. They had had the experience of their forefathers before them, and they thought that they could become kings of both countries. Edward III, who had initiated this war, had in fact been the grandson of the French king Philip IV. Philip had 3 sons, but none of them had male heirs. And after the 3 sons died, the English king, who was the son of Philip's daughter, thought that it was possible for him to inherit the English throne. But the French aristocracy didn't want a foreign king. They decided in favor of the cousin of those dead sons of Philip, and the prince was also called Philip, the future King Philip VI, the first Valois king. He was the nephew of Philip IV, the cousin of the later three kings who had died without issue. And he was proclaimed King of France by the French nobility who supported this idea. But the English king had the rights to the throne as well. He thought differently. And in the year 1337, the so-called 100 Years' War began, which lasted until the year 1453. With interruptions, it lasted for 116 years. And first, it was quite favorable for the English, and in the beginning of the 15th century, two English kings at least, Henry V and Henry VI, were also crowned as French kings. They were officially crowned as French kings on the territory of France. Not a mean achievement, not an insignificant achievement by any means. And in this situation, now I am returning to the initial point, it was quite impossible to continue using French as the state language of England when the war with France was going on. And thus, in the second period, in the second part of the Middle English period, which, let's agree, began in 1066 and lasted until the year 1500, in the middle of this period, it became completely impossible for the English people of using the French language, and they had to think of switching on to their own native language, which at that time was not in a very impressive state. And in the middle of the 14th century, the period of the rapid development of the English language began. Geoffrey Chaucer, the clerks of the Chancery, the theologians, the Lollards, all these were the people who contributed greatly to the development of the English language in the second part of the Middle English period. Thank you very much for your attention.